What's usually the first nation you play as in a brand new strategy game? Many players quite enjoy playing as countries they have a personal connection with. Perhaps it is because we identify with our own or our ancestors' home countries. Or maybe we know the respective country's actual history and can thus compare our own way of playing them with what really happened. It is incredibly fun to create alt history scenarios in game with countries you actually identify with and know a lot about. This is why we had the idea to create a video in which several passionate Victoria 3 players talk about their home countries and how accurately they feel Paradox represents them in game. After myself talking about Britain, our writer Seb will talk about Austria-Hungary and our editor Alex about the Ottoman Empire. Additionally, we partnered up with the up-and-coming YouTuber King Jupiter, who has Nigerian roots and lives in the Saarland, Germany. He will talk about his connections to both and assess Paradox's portrayal of the two. Let us know in the comments how your home country is portrayed in the game and if you are happy with it. And if you like our content, don't forget to like and subscribe for more history in bits. I grew up in a typically small town in the green and peaceful countryside of southern England. It feels a whole world away from the great metropolis that is London, only a short 45-minute train journey from where I was born. London, whilst overwhelmingly huge, busy, and at times very stressful, is still a fantastic place to live. I studied and worked there for 5 years, but I would have only sampled a fraction of what the city has to offer. One of its greatest hallmarks could be its multiculturalism, evident in the variation of food, music, events, and people I lived and worked with. There is history everywhere you look, in the monuments, buildings, street names, tube stations, with such cultural wealth still on display from a bygone era, alongside the diverse mix of people living here today. There is no hiding that this city was once the beating heart of the largest empire the world has ever known. In Victoria 3's starting date, Britain is clearly the strongest power in the game by a long shot. It has colonies and dominions on every continent, an unrivaled navy twice the size of the next competitor, a huge treasury, and a massive head start in industrialisation. This is largely an accurate portrayal. Although Britain had lost the 13 North American colonies as a result of the American Revolution of the 1770s, what had been labelled the era of high imperialism by historians was only about to peak in the mid to the late 19th century. Although it feels a little daunting to play it as the UK, with so much to worry about across the globe, it actually isn't all that bad. You see, the major territories in Canada, South Africa, India and Oceania are treated as dominions in-game. This means that whilst they pay you tax, are automatically part of your market and are forced into your walls, you do not directly control them, and you can in fact choose to play as them. I think that this is a great improvement on vanilla Vicky 2, where you had direct control over everything, and it is more realistic as well. The British government historically delegated power to British governors in its global colonies. In India, for example, it was only after the Sepoy Rebellion of 1857 that the government found justification to transfer the colonies to the Crown from the privately run East India Company, declaring Queen Victoria as Empress of India and beginning direct British rule of the Indian subcontinent. It is great that this event, the creation of the British Raj, can actually happen in Victoria 3, but I do think that the Dominion system needs a lot of improving. There should be a system, similar to Crusader Kings 3, in which you can change and negotiate how much a vassal nation such as a Dominion pays taxes, war contributions, or other obligations to its sovereign. Furthermore, it would be much more interesting to have company colonies play in a different way, as they functioned much differently to a normal nation. I would put my money on Paradox releasing a much more intricate vassal state system as a DLC in the future. As the Imperial historians Martin Thomas and Andrew Thompson point out, Britain pursued a distinctively and expansively imperial vision of its place in the world order, which joined together a complex formal territorial empire, with an equally complex yet informal system of influence, interest, and interference. One example of this interference would be the Opium Wars, when Britain sent their military to force China to let British merchants sell opium to the Chinese public. Not only is this an actual event the British can take if Qing China bans opium, but it is historically not an exception for a major power to simply have the choice of threatening to go to war unless a country opens their market or surrenders a treaty port. The same can be said for the choice to abolish slavery. In 1896, Britain declared war on Zanzibar after a conflict arose over the subject of abolition of slavery. The war lasted a total of 38 minutes, and is the shortest recorded war in history. Whilst, in my opinion, the diplomatic plays feature in Vicky 3 needs to be fleshed out, I believe it is on the right track. Aside from the difficulty of managing the humongous British market, playing the UK in Victoria 3 can get a little monotonous. There is no great nation-building story like with Prussia, as the UK was already fully formed by 1836. Nor are you ever really under threat of complete collapse like in Qing China, unless you've royally screwed things up. As for the endgame, there should be the challenge of maintaining the number one power by keeping the USA and Germany at bay, like in Victoria 2. Check out our video on this subject. But right now at least, this is way too easy. Germany can sometimes struggle to form, and when it does, there is not any great war mechanic to make the last act of the game have a climactic and challenging finish. And as for the USA, it's a bit of a mess and easy to keep down. What would greatly improve the gameplay of the UK would be to enrich the flavour and game mechanics of domestic policy within the British Isles. It is in the unique position of being a combination of 4 countries, England, Scotland, Wales, and at the time, Ireland. This could make for interesting political decisions and manoeuvring in order to keep everyone happy, or more historically, keep everyone south of Cambridge happy to the detriment of everyone else. There should be the choice of having various people of these countries represented in Parliament, and more choice to integrate or segregate people of their respective countries. Furthermore, the relationship between Britain and Ireland is seriously lacking. The Irish potato famine should absolutely be included as it led to widespread death and migration. Ireland is the only country in the world to have a smaller population today than it did in 1841. You as the player should have a choice of how much aid one can provide to help or hinder the situation. Right now, it seems your influence on the future of these countries is far too limited, and they are too similar to one another. Ultimately, I do think that the game did a good job of portraying Britain, although it is a little basic in its current state. But I'm sure it will most likely improve in future patches and updates. It would be sad otherwise, given that the whole game is named after the British Queen giving the era its name.
Growing up in Austria, in a little town close to Vienna, there was always this feeling of imperial hangover looming over my small and politically insignificant home country. The Grand Vienna Opera, the imperial palaces we used to visit on school trips, or the museums filled with relics of the Holy Roman Empire and the Habsburg crown. The sight of lofty Baroque houses and impressive imperial buildings was normal to us as kids, but there wasn't any political association we had with them. What was still very prevalent even in the 1990s, I would say, was Austria's struggle for an identity. As Austrians also speak German, just in a different dialect, the most important aspect of our national identity has since the end of World War II been our dissociation from Germany, which often results in surprisingly nasty, but mostly silly, hostility towards Germans. At the starting date of Victoria 3, there is not yet a unified Germany. Also, the Austrian Empire is not the dual monarchy later known as Austria-Hungary, which is historically accurate. It wasn't until the Ausgleich, the Austro-Hungarian Compromise of 1867, that Hungary became an internally autonomous state within the empire, with its own parliament and internal policy. Just as in reality, the empire is very multicultural in Victoria 3, so the player can use the Ausgleich to appease the Hungarians, the largest non-German group within the empire. When diving more into the realm of alternate history, more exciting opportunities arise for the Habsburg-ruled Austria. In a not yet unified Germany consisting of many small states and principalities, it is not clear whether Prussia or Austria will dominate the German-speaking lands. After all, both of them were great powers at the time, and while Austria started to fall behind militarily during the 19th century, it had a very strong diplomatic position. It was in Vienna where the Concert of Europe, the peace order after the Napoleonic Wars, was designed. The problem about Austria, in the game as well as in reality, was its internal divisions. This prison of nations, as it has been called by the enemies of the Habsburgs, was inherently difficult to govern, let alone modernize, in a way that would make it realistic for the Habsburgs to swallow up the rest of Germany to create a unified German Empire under Habsburg rule. Nevertheless, this was discussed in 1848 as the so-called Großdeutsche Lösung by the Frankfurt Parliament. But in my opinion, this idea was always quite unrealistic, and not only because Prussia vehemently opposed it. Austria's ethnic diversity was simply too big a challenge for the Habsburgs to be able to concentrate on actually having power over Germany. So the most realistic aim for a historically informed player of Austria in Wiki 3 is probably to just keep the existing empire together. This is already quite a challenge in a time of increasing nationalism and national demands for sovereignty. Thus, if you want to achieve this, at least in Victoria 3, you have to be progressive AF. Liberalize your social policies, like citizenship, to assure ethnic minorities' rights and therefore their willingness to stay part of the empire. Also, you'll have to weaken the aristocrats, later known as the landowners, because they will be the interest group that most opposes such liberalization. And also push economic development to increase the standard of living and make people as well fed and happy as possible. To end this on a personal note, I am not at all regretful of the fact that the Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved, even though for summer holiday it would be nice to still have access to the Adriatic. The successor states of the Habsburgs are now all well-functioning, liberal democracies, and it can be doubted that they would have achieved this in an empire or even in a setting of some sort of constitutional monarchy or republican federation. Still, as a Wiki 3 player, it is very fun to save the Habsburg spots by making them super progressive Vokesters.
I grew up in Austria, but I'm half Turkish and always had a strong connection to my father's country. I guess most of you know that at the starting date of Victoria 3, there was no Turkey. Instead, the peninsula of Anatolia was ruled by the once mighty Ottoman Empire, which also ruled large parts of North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula and the Balkans. I actually find it kind of funny that both of my parents' countries were at that point large empires destined to fail. Still, I felt Turkish people were quite fascinated by and proud of their imperial history, which is still reflected in the old towns of Istanbul and other Turkish cities. But when I was younger, I was never aware that the predecessor of the Turkish Republic used to be such an important world power. And, well, in 1836, at the start of the game, it actually wasn't anymore. The Ottoman Empire in the 19th century was often labeled the sick man of Europe, slowly but surely losing military power and influence in the region. Greece gained its independence from the Ottomans in 1828, right before the start of Victoria 3, and the Russians were increasingly dominating the Black Sea region, supporting Orthodox nationalists in the Balkans and the Caucasus. However, the Ottomans did try to modernize in the 19th century. In the so-called Tanzimat period, between 1839 and 1876, they reformed their army, their banking and postal system, enacted social reforms and introduced secular law. In this period, they also received military support by France, Britain and Piemont-Sardinia against the ever stronger Russian Empire in the Crimean War, and so they successfully resisted the Russians in the Balkans. In the game, playing the Ottomans is a challenge from the very start. So, how to cure the sick man of Europe? Luckily, we have an event in our journal at the beginning, which gives us a rough idea of how to do that. The entry basically requires us to complete at least 4 of the Tanzimat entries. Until those are completed, we are stuck with negative modifiers like -25% taxation capacity or -33% prestige. Most players agreed that the hardest tasks to accomplish are the education reform and reclaiming Syria, so we are focusing on the other 4. For the urbanization reform, simply build industries and government administrations to increase population in your cities. The Bureaucratic reform, however, might be a bit more difficult. But basically this could be achieved by having the right policies enacted. Furthermore, you have to modernize your army. This is accomplished by researching technologies and then enhancing your troops. Another requirement is to have at least 250 battalions. To do this, just build a lot of barracks. The suppress separatism task is considered the easiest, because you basically just have to send in the army whenever a revolt comes up. Congrats! With those 4 journal entries achieved, you just cured the sick man of Europe. I mean, at least the negative modifiers are gone. Since it was quite interesting getting into the gameplay mechanics of the Ottoman Empire in Wiki 3, we thought we might do a full separate video just focusing on how accurately the empire is portrayed in the game by providing historical backgrounds. Let us know in the comments if you might be interested in that.
G'day, it's me, Jupiter. People know me, if at all, from my Victoria 3 Africa video, but I very much am mostly German and I proudly live in the Saarland. We in the Saarland, similarly to our 16 km squared larger neighbor of Luxembourg, have a very strong regional identity. The old Saarland flag and the Saarlandish dialect are very much commonplace. We often differentiate between us and the rest of the Reich, which is how we call the rest of Germany. What many people don't know is that we only joined the current Republic of Germany as late as 1959. Hence we intentionally cut most historical ties with the militaristic, indifferent unifier of Prussia, and focus on either pre-Napoleonic history during the independent county of Saarbrücken, or post-World War I history during our independence as the Saar Protectorate. The only Prussian symbolism I can think of is the Saarbrücker Town Hall, street names and the facade of some old buildings like the Europagalerie. But you still mustn't forget that under Prussian management, the Saarland went from rags to riches. While industrialization and coal mining started around 1750, the Prussians definitely embraced it, turning provincial hinterlands into one of the biggest industrial areas of Germany. Now, how is Germany represented in game? As pessimistic as I often am, overall, Germany's done kinda well. My main complaints are some design choices like not splitting nations like they have been historically, but overall it's kinda fine. Germany does form a bit too rarely. That is indeed a problem, I don't think it's intentional. But let's be honest here, it's gonna get fixed, like, probably very soon. As I said, if you know me, you probably know me from my Africa video. And whilst I am German, I'm also partial Nigerian, and I have a strong connection to the country. Even though I haven't lived in Nigeria, yet at least. Because of that, I got into African history, and decided to learn as much about the history as possible, because I felt like, well, no one else would. And as I elaborated in 10 minutes and 31 seconds, I am very disappointed in the research Paradox did, or rather, the lack thereof. Whilst I didn't go too much into detail in my video, Nigeria and Victoria 3 is sadly not the exception for the rest of Africa. The only nation with a correct capital is Benin with Benin City. The only starting monarch that's correct is Mohammed Bello in Sokoto, with the rest being unregenerated. And they use very weird states that cut through multiple different biomes, habitats and peoples, which makes interacting with them extremely unorganic. That the demographics aren't right is totally understandable. It's just kinda shame that they didn't even try, like making Oya 100% animist, whilst most of Oya's struggles at the time was the growing Muslim minority, which my family is a part of, by the way. Oyo should also be a constitutional monarchy, not an absolute principality, because of governing bodies like the parliament or prime minister, who had a lot of power, including who gets to be king and who gets to stay king. Funnily enough, that governing body is actually represented in EU4, not in Victoria 3. I don't know why. And all this is based on the assumption that Oyo was even a nation at the time, showing them as a centralized nation in 1836. While it's not wrong 10 years before the start date, it completely ignores Yoruba Revolutionary Wars, a multi-way tribal civil war that is so darn interesting I'd have to make a video on it someday. They also really wanted to make Benin extremely long for some reason. Historically, it was a city-state, not a city-snake. I get setting priorities, but I think Paradox handled Africa extremely poorly. So far at least. The future is uncertain and will hopefully only change for the better. And until that future is in the base game, I still have mods to play with.
Thank you for joining us for this special video about how our home countries are depicted in Victoria 3. Be sure to check out King Jupiter's channel and his more in-depth video on Africa in the game. If you want to see more content on history and historically inspired strategy games, please like and subscribe to our channel for more history in bits.